Excited. I met Regina, oh my gosh, many years ago when I saw her speak before she had done her docudrama and the book that she had repurposed and created again came out. And it's just so nice after all this time to finally be able to see her speak, as so much has happened since then. So Regina Mason is an international speaker, author, executive producer, and storyteller who believes in the extraordinary will of the human spirit. Through the power of her story, she challenges audiences to recast painful chapters in America's past in a light that empowers, inspires, and transforms our thinking. She has spent 15 years researching the life and times of her great-great-great-grandfather, pioneering fugitive slave autobiographer William Grimes. The seed for her search was unwittingly planted in a fifth grade class assignment on origins and ancestry, where she thought she did not have a history worth trumpeting. She has spent nearly a lifetime turning a negative into a positive that would one day culminate with a new edition of her ancestors' book and now an acclaimed film documentary. And oh my gosh, the movie is so worth getting, and I'll talk a little bit more about it at the end, but this is just a powerful story of persistence, I think, more than anything else. And it's not just the persistence of her great-great-great-grandfather, but the persistence of Regina to get to the bottom of this story. And I thank you, Regina, for sharing this with us so we can learn a little bit about what you've learned in the process of discovering your great-great-great-grandfather, William Grimes. With that, I am complete, and let's turn it over to you.
Anastasia, thank you so much. You know, it's an honor to be in your presence. I haven't seen you in, well, virtual presence, I should say. I haven't seen you in many years, but we never lost that connection. And thank you so much for putting in a good word for me to be part of this extraordinary group, the Golden Gate Breakfast Club. You guys are just amazing people. I'm so ordinary compared to you all. And thank you for allowing me to share your virtual space. So yes, I am the great-great-great-granddaughter of William Grimes, who penned the first fugitive slave narrative in American history. And I'm sure that none of you until now have heard his name. And by the way, I'm happy to be in the presence of Booker T. Washington's descendant, Sarah, as well. You all should know that name. He is an illustrious figure in American history. William Grimes may have paved the way for other slave narratives to follow, including the Booker T. Washington Up From Slavery narrative, which I've read as well. So how did I discover this narrative? I'm often asked that question. And by the grace of God, it just really fell into my lap. But seedlings were planted many years ago in 1971 when I was in the 5th grade at St. Augustine School in Oakland, California. I was given a class assignment, well, everyone in the class was, to connect with our country of origin and our family history. And this was an oral report that began with me asking the question to my mother, where are we from? As you can see by my appearance alone, I am a multi-ethnic person. My family is truly American. My family's history can be traced back to this country to the 1600s. I didn't know this in the beginning, but it would take me a lifetime to piece all of this together. And by the way, no one knew that there was a narrative in the family. How that came to me, I'll share a little later. But anyway, this class assignment was for me to discover who I was in a sense, but it also meant connecting to a very painful past. When I asked my mother where we from, we talked about roots in the Bay Area and in the Pacific Northwest. Slavery never came up, and Africa never came up until my mother told me about her grandfather, Grandpa Fuller, who was born into slavery in the 1850s in Georgia. And it shocked me because she knew this man. And she told me a story that was quite sad. She never met any of his family members, and he was very tight-lipped about his history. To talk about being enslaved was painful. And it was shocking to me because I, for the first time, learned that I descended from slaves, those who were enslaved. And it was shocking to me to learn that my mother actually knew her grandfather, who had been born enslaved. So I saw that slavery was just a few generations from me. It was no longer in the abstract, those people from long ago. It was made personal, and it was actually not that far away. So my other focus for this assignment was to talk about my country of origin. And that meant looking to Africa. Not a big deal, right? Beautiful continent and so forth. But the imagery that I saw as a child about Africa was so distorted. It's so exaggerated in stereotypes that I did not feel any kinship or association. And so it then became for me, how do I share this with my classmates? What do I say to them? I don't want to talk about slavery, and I certainly don't want to talk about an African connection that I felt no kinship to. Perhaps if I had learned as a child that Africa was the motherland to all of the humankind, maybe I would have had a different perspective, but that was not being taught in a parochial education back in the early 70s. And I knew that there was this movement going on in my community. I mean, it was at the height of the civil rights movement that gave way to Black nationalism, and particularly in the Bay Area with the Black Panthers and so forth. I saw all that. I didn't recognize or know what it was all about. But this class assignment got me thinking about a lot of things on a lot of different levels. And I began to understand the sort of rage that was spilling out in the community. I started paying attention, and I asked my mother for more information about my heritage. And she, being the youngest of 5 children with big gaps in between them, she didn't know much about it. So what she gave me was very painful. And whatever inspiring details she was trying to impart, they were overshadowed with this inherent complexity of my newly revealed enslaved heritage. I just couldn't get beyond it in one sitting. And so about a week after the class assignment, which I survived, and I basically mumbled something insignificant about the African continent, because another challenge that is faced for African Americans is connecting with that country of origin is really hard for us to do, particularly back in the day when this assignment was given to me. Now we have DNA that could help us trace where in that continent we may have come from, but I didn't have those tools available to me. There were only two other African Americans in the classroom, and by that time we were calling ourselves Black, and they had the same struggle as I did. They could not connect to that continent because those ties were so severed that they could not be articulated. So all that we could say was we were from Africa, but we certainly could not pinpoint where exactly, whereas all my other classmates knew firsthand their country of origin. Many of them knew their roots in the United States. They were able to speak to things that I could not speak to. So my mother, sensing my misgivings about my heritage, she took me to see Aunt Katherine. This was after the assignment. And Aunt Katherine was the storyteller in the family, and she was also the family historian. And I remember her embracing me and telling me, "Oh, you do have a proud history." And so once I was able to get beyond this enslaved heritage, I was able to receive these wonderful gifts from both my mother and my Aunt Katherine. And Aunt Katherine told me that her great-grandmother was a Shakespearean performer in the San Francisco Bay Area, and that she performed to integrated audiences. She couldn't give me a timeline, but if some of the things had been pegged on a timeline, it would have taken my breath away. Neither of us knew that this was the era of the California gold rush that she was talking about. So as the Civil War was raging on in the South, my family was in San Francisco, my great-great-grandmother performing plays to integrated audiences that I would find out years later as I got into this research. But the one story that Aunt Katherine told me that stayed with me for years was merely 3 little clues that she gave me. She told me that someone by the name of Grimes from New Haven, Connecticut, was associated with the Underground Railroad. Well, that blew my mind because I was a 5th grader, just learning about American slavery, just learning about the Underground Railroad. And to hear that I had someone connected with the Underground Railroad was huge in my mind because it was a resistance story. It was a story that I needed to hear. And I remember begging her for more information, but she had given me all she knew. And what she gave me were 3 little clues: the Grimes surname, the city of New Haven, and the Underground Railroad. So let's fast forward 20 some years. I never forgot those stories. And by this time, it's in the 90s. I am a young wife and mother of 2 little girls. And I wanted them to know their history. So I began the process of genealogy. And I began pairing that process with books on the Underground Railroad, the abolitionist movement. I was hoping to find a reference of a man named Grimes from New Haven, Connecticut, who had a connection to the Underground Railroad. Well, after months and months of disappointments, a reality of how big my task was began to set in. And I thought, well, this is actually too tedious and maybe not the right direction to go. But one day I had all these library books that were due to be returned, and I picked up a title that I had not read, and it was Charles L. Bloxon's book, The Underground Railroad. I immediately turned to the New England section, and within the first few paragraphs of that book, Bloxon described a man by the name of William Grimes, who stowed away on a vessel from Savannah, Georgia to New York City. And once he got to New York, he was put in contact with workers on the Underground Railroad who directed him on foot to New Haven, Connecticut. I was floored. This was definitely clues that I had to follow, because those 3 clues that Aunt Katherine gave me showed up in one little paragraph. Well, where did Bloxam get his information? Well, it turns out that the bibliography revealed that this William Grimes person had written his life story and published it himself in 1825. I had never heard talk of a narrative. I didn't know if this Grimes belonged to me, but I had to find out. So it turns out that The Life of William Grimes, The Runaway Slave, was republished in an anthology in 1971 called 5 Black Lives. That book was still in print, and Cody's bookstore in Berkeley, California, right near the Berkeley campus, it's no longer, but it was legendary in its day, had a copy on its shelf. I immediately went there, bought, they actually had 3 copies. I bought all 3 copies, not even knowing if this man belonged to me, but something deep down told me that he did. And as I delved into that man's story, the language astonished me. Unrelenting misery plagued this man's life, leaving him profoundly embittered. And I'm going to read a little bit to you because I want you to hear his voice. He says, those who wish to know who Grimes is and what is his history, he would inform them that he is now living in Litchfield, Connecticut, that he's about 40 years of age, that he's married to a Black woman and passes for a Negro, though 3 parts white, that he was born in a place in Virginia, has lived in several different states, and been owned by 10 different masters, that about 9 years since, he ran away, came to Connecticut, where he was recognized by some of his former master's friends, taken up and compelled to purchase his freedom with the sacrifice of all he had earned. I'm skipping some of this because I want to get to one point here. He says, let anyone suppose himself a husband, a father, possessed of a house, a home, and livelihood. A stranger enters that house before his children, and in fair daylight puts the chain on his leg, where it remains till the last cent of his property, buys from avarice and cruelty the remnant of a life whose best years has been spent in misery. Let anyone imagine this and think what I have felt. William Grimes, Litchfield, October 1st, 1824. William Grimes had been living in Connecticut for about 9 years as a fugitive. His master finds him. By this time, he's a property owner. He has his own business. He is a barber by profession. He's in Litchfield, Connecticut, where the first law school of its kind was established, which is the Tapping Reeve Law School. He's working, and his clients are the learned men at this law school. He's cutting the hair of the governor of Connecticut. But he is also very industrious. He's a property owner. He is a businessman, but he's also a fugitive on the run, constantly looking over his shoulder in fear of being found out. Because at this law school, it is one of the first institutions in the country where the North and the South meet together. And so he is among Southerners who knew him in not only Savannah, Georgia, but in Virginia, where he was born, King George County. So he is also in New Haven, Connecticut, which is the bustling, I should say, seaport, where the Yale College is. And he is, at some point, he's working there as a servant among a general servant among the students at Yale College. Yale would eventually have their own law school, and William Grimes would also be a servant there as well. He, not only that, he's very business savvy. He, as a barber, which was an African-American profession at the time, that was quite lucrative. It meant stability in the community and in employment. And so he opens up a place of business also in New Haven. He, at one point, rents out his home, moves to New Haven where he thinks he can do better financially. So he has this connection with this intellectual hub in both Litchfield, Connecticut, and in New Haven. So again, he is spotted at least 3 times from 3 different people that knew him from the South. And whenever the sighting would happen or take place, he'd uproot altogether and head out to another New England town so that he could avoid recapture. 9 years later, he couldn't avoid it. His master finds him and demands that he gives up the deed, demands that he pays for his freedom. He had no choice but to give up the deed to his home in order to pay for freedom. And so his book is, how can I say, it is to open wounds that have not healed. His book reopens these wounds, and it reads so bitterly. He opens his book with biting sarcasm. I was born in the year 1784 in the county of King George, Virginia, in a land boasting its freedom and under a government whose motto is liberty and equality. I was yet born a slave. He opens his book with the hypocrisy of America, and he closes his book with the same pointed hypocrisy and message to the American people about America and its lofty promises. He says this: I hope some will buy my books from charity, but I am no beggar. I am now entirely destitute of property. Where and how I shall die, where and how I shall live, I don't know. Where and how I shall die, I don't know. But I hope I may be prepared. If it were not for the stripes on my back, which were made while I was a slave, I would, in my will, leave my skin as a legacy to the government, desiring that it might be taken off and made into parchment, and then bind the Constitution of glorious, happy, and free America. Let the skin of an American slave bind the charter of American liberty. So he closes his 1825 narrative with those bold words. Now, I'm reading this narrative not knowing if this William Grimes is related to me. I had a hunch, but I had not the solidifying connection. And so I would spend a year and a half in the archives trying to make this connection that I could not do. I was going back too far, too fast. I needed something, some sort of proof. And I looked to his narrative for clues that might link the past to the present. And William Grimes's narrative is not written in the traditional autobiography format. It is really sort of a letter to America, talking about the injustices of having been born enslaved. So he's not talking about his family so much, but he does reference his wife as Clarissa Caesar, the lovely and all accomplished Clarissa Caesar, as he called her. And I remember calling my Aunt Katherine and asking her, is Caesar a family name? And she said, she didn't know for sure. She said, oh, Gina, I've got to get you the family Bible pages. All of the family names are written in it. Well, that just threw me for a loop. Where is this Bible? Who has it? Well, Aunt Katherine eventually took a trip to Portland, Oregon, and she came home with the Bible pages. And in those pages appeared the name William Grimes with the recorded death date of August 21st, 1865. And when I saw reference of that death date, I knew that this was the William Grimes who had penned the slave narrative, Life of William Grimes, the Runaway Slave. And I knew this because I had found obituaries of this William Grimes, the author. I couldn't at the time make the connection, but the family Bible page solidified that connection. And that is how I was able to show proof of being William Grimes's great, great, great granddaughter. Now, I was not familiar with slave narratives. I had read a few. I had read Frederick Douglass, I had read Booker T. Washington, and I had read a few others. But I needed someone to help me make sense of William Grimes's book. So I partnered with Dr. William L. Andrews, who is an expert on early African-American autobiography. And he was the only living scholar who had written about William Grimes that I could reach out to. And when I say who had written about him, he had essentially written about 3 or 4 pages. No one had dug beneath the surface of this slave narrative until I came along. In fact, I would spend 15 years from discovering William Grimes all the way to getting published in the new edition of the Grimes narrative that was released in 2008. And what I did was I started sharing snippets of my research with Dr. Andrews. And one day he approached me and said, look, you have taken this narrative to new heights. There should be a new one out there. Well, I had never been published before. He said, look, I can help you with my expertise. I can give great insights to this narrative. Your research will definitely expose and corroborate the Grimes story. We should team up. And so we did. In 2008, in Oxford University republished a Grimes narrative fully annotated by myself. And so in this narrative, you get 3 voices. You get first Bill Andrews, who is the expert on African-American autobiography. Then you also get William Grimes's story, and then my story as well, which was the precursor to the docudrama, Gina's Journey, The Search for William Grimes. Now, I'm looking at the time, I've seen 3 minutes over, but I hope you'll give me a few more minutes to share how precedent-setting this Grimes narrative is. And I could not have known this had I not partnered with Bill Andrews. So William Grimes, his 1825 narrative appeared at a time when African-American autobiography was rare. Okay, an expanded edition appeared in 1855 with an image of William Grimes, as you can see here, when he was of old age. And what he did was he appended a chapter to the end of his 1825 book, which chronicles his life in old age. And he did this because he's up there in age, he can no longer make a living for himself. So he thought if he brought his book back, he can then generate some money that would carry him through his old age. But the most important narrative is the 1825 narrative because of this reason. William Grimes was the first person to go through slavery in the South and write about it. I really want you to understand this. This was the first time that American slavery was written about from the perspective of one who had been enslaved in the South, and not from the enslaver who controlled the narrative. That was a huge accomplishment. William Grimes is the first fugitive slave narrative to bear the title written by himself. This is in 1825. Reading and writing in many states was against the law. So for him to come out with a book that says written by himself was a revolutionary, bold statement to make. The Grimes narrative came out 8 years before the American Anti-Slavery Society was formed. This is before William Lloyd Garrison, the most famous abolitionist, and his newspaper, The Liberator. They were not even on the radar. It came out 8 years before that. It came out before Freedom's Journal, the first African-American newspaper in the country, which came out in 1827 in New York City. It came out before, if you've heard of Nat Turner's rebellion in Southampton, Virginia in 1831, came out before that. And William Grimes was the first of the slave narratives to talk about how hard it was for an African American to carve out a free life in the quote unquote free North. He was always battling court cases, always trying to be warned out of town by selectmen who were not happy with the progress he was making. He was outperforming poorer whites who felt entitled to William Grimes's achievements because that was the law of the land. It was not designed for African Americans to ascend. It was in defiance of white privilege. And so we get a sense too of what it was like to live in the North. And by the way, William Grimes is living in the North when there is a gradual emancipation process taking place. And in Connecticut, they were the last state to abolish slavery. I believe that was in 1847, if I'm not mistaken. So even though William Grimes was in Connecticut at the time, slavery was still going on, but there was a gradual emancipation taking place. Famous fugitive slave narratives of the 1840s and 50s that were stock in trade of the abolitionist movement, they were either dictated to, corroborated by, edited by, and even ghostwritten by white people. William Grimes was beholden to no one. His is an authentic voice of literary independence, which means he is telling his story, and he's telling it in very harsh terms. So it's not palatable for a white audience. Other slave narratives that came after his were, even though they too spell out the horrors of slavery, they also were edited by, so that they could, white sponsors, so that they could be more appealing in a sense to a white audience. William Grimes is in contrast of all of that. So he's telling a very graphic, brutal story. And finally, and this puts it all into perspective, Frederick Douglass is the most famous fugitive slave autobiographer. He's a brilliant man, as we know. But Frederick Douglass was only 7 years old when the Grimes narrative appeared. So we get a sense of how pioneering and precedent-setting the Grimes narrative is. And so my talk, I titled it The Slave Narrative That Freed Me, because here it is, William Grimes, a man who picked up the bare bones of reading and writing. He doesn't tell us exactly how he learned to read and write, but he leaves clues in his book. He talks, there are at least 4 occasions where he's talking about being literate. And in the Q&A, we can delve further into that. But William Grimes gave me permission to succeed with all of the obstacles that he faced. The fact that he was not educated, but he was in intellectual circles. He gave me permission to excel as well. I would not believe that I would be the one to edit his narrative. And in fact, I didn't think I could. I didn't think it was with me, but he showed me that it was. I never thought that I would be able to pull together a team to create an award-winning docudrama, but William Grimes told me, by extension, by his example, showed me that I could. So I'm going to conclude my talk with that, and I thank you all for your listening ears. Now go ahead and open it up.
Yeah, thank you, Regina.
Thank you.
You know, a couple of thoughts. You know, I mean, I would have to think that William Grimes, if he could be here today, would be very proud of you and be very grateful that, you know, his story is being shared to a new audience. And I look forward to reading his narrative.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to get a copy. The other question I had for you, actually, let's move things on. Tom Kowalski had a question, which is in the chat. So if anyone has a question, feel free to either put it in the chat where we can monitor it, or just raise your hand and we can call you out for any questions. So the first question we have here is from Tom Kowalski. He says, what are your thoughts on compensation to those families who were slaves of the families?
Okay, repeat that question. It got kind of muffled. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. What are your thoughts on compensation to those who were slaves of their families?
Compensation in terms of reparations. Is that where we're going with this?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to take it from that perspective, because it is a hot topic in the news these days. Reparations. I do believe that African Americans are due some sort of reparations, okay? Not necessarily, and this is my opinion, in a cash payout to individuals. I think we can look at reparations in another light that will ensure education for African Americans, college educations. I think we need to look at it from an economic standpoint of home ownership. It is very difficult for some, and this is generationally, because when I think of my family generationally, to have property in the family that was taken to pay for a freedom that no one else had to pay for, it is mind-boggling to me. What if that property had stayed in the family generationally? You know, that would be definitely a feather in our cap. It would also mean upward mobility and so forth. So that's important to me. So I do believe in reparations in that regard, in that we can level the playing field so that it is a more equitable state for African Americans to compete. So here's to give you a deeper insight. And I didn't talk much about William Grimes's parentage. His mother was an enslaved African American woman. He, in the beginning, I told you, he defined himself as 3 parts white, but passed as a Negro. His father was written about in his book, not named, but he talked about his murder that took place on his father's plantation. His father is a wealthy white planter. I researched that murder, and I was able to piece together the estate, Eagle's Nest in King George County, which still stands today, built in the 1670s, stayed in the family for 15 generations. It was sold to outsiders in 1974, the year I began high school. We can look at that situation, that one family of generational wealth that and property ownership that's remained in the family for all of those generations. Let's say, what if William Grimes was able to do the same thing? So we see that imbalance that stayed in the family for 300 years. 300 years. What a leg up in society. And so Benjamin Grimes not only was a wealthy planter, but he was also a very good friend of General George Washington. They were actually neighbors. His father, George Washington's father, had lived on a nearby estate to Eagle's Nest. George Washington didn't even stay at Eagle's Nest. They even have an autograph book in the family where George Washington has signed his name, and they even have an area to show where William Grimes stayed at Eagle's Nest Estate. So anyway, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that these families in King George County, they were all interconnected with the first families of this country. Names like Robert E. Lee, who is the grandson of Lucy Grimes, who is Benjamin Grimes. Lucy Grimes is Benjamin Grimes's first cousin. So the Grimes narrative, once we got into uncovering this story, it was not only William Grimes' story from enslavement to freedom, but it is also a window into America's early beginnings. So I can go on, and I hope I did answer the question, the initial question.
Well, I think you more than answer it. It's a big question, and so a lot of different ways to examine it. And I thought you did a great job. Bert Hill has his hand up. Bert.
Yeah, I just had a question. When you talk about reparations, one area that would be very interesting is, as you probably know, when the big developments in New York and San Francisco built the freeway systems, they targeted African-American neighborhoods, and they forced eminent domain on them. There were, and most people lost everything, but that was actually going on in the Midwest too during the Depression, where they were overly separated from the land that they were working on. I think that would be a very likely first target in reparation, tracing that back just to provide equity, because it was racially defined at that time. And the other thing that so I think that fits within your ideas on it too. Interesting side note: I have a colleague and friend named Jeff Taliaferro here in San Francisco who has ocean cyclery. I'd be interested in finding out if he is the famous Taliaferro name.
Very interesting. I recognize that name in early Virginia history, and it definitely intertwines with those first families in Virginia. They integrated or intermarried with the Fitzhughs, the Lees, the Washingtons, all of that took place. So that name is not new to me. And I'm certain there is a connection. I'd be curious to know as well.
Yeah. Great bicyclist.
All right. Thank you, Bert. I don't see any other hands up, but if anyone has their questions. I'm looking at Janice Lippin has her hand up. Janice, why don't you go first?
Regina, what a powerful story. And there's so much to unpack and think about that I can't even do it in this sitting. I would love to sit with you for an afternoon and ask you all the questions and all the directions my mind is going. But the one thing that stuck out for me is the dichotomy of the white slave owner and the black slave who can't get that connection and still had to give up his property for his freedom. What a powerful message. But back to you said he was 3 parts white. What do you know about the other white ancestors and their families? And was there ever a connection made between these families going generations out?
Well, what it tells me, when 3 parts white but passed as a Negro, it tells me that he was, a quarter African American. And it also tells me that his mother had to be of mixed race as well. Mm-hmm. Okay, I do not know anything about his mother, not her name. He does not name her in his book. In fact, he leaves lots of blanks. He didn't name his father as well. But the way I was able to figure out who his father was because of a murder that took place on the plantation, Eagle's Nest, and it was written about in the Virginia Gazette and so forth. So the only thing I know about his mother was that she gave birth to him, and that is it. I think I know from a slave inventory her name, but I have not been able to piece together that solidifying piece of information. So the only thing I know about William Grimes's European heritage is through his father, and tracing that name to the early the mid 1600s in this country. I wish I knew more, and I'm always on the lookout for her. But let me tell you, in this digital age, there is hope. And so I pursue her whenever I can, but I wish I could tell you more. I just can't.
You also talked early in your talk about knowing the traces went back to the continent of Africa. Now, through your research, have you pinpointed better where in Africa those traces come from?
Definitely West Africa, and this is all through the DNA and so forth. And I took my DNA when had that sampled when it was cutting edge. It was very new. Now we can really pinpoint a lot better the different countries. So I have not, I should take an updated DNA sampling. I haven't yet, but I have not been able to make that African connection with William Grimes. But William Grimes married into a Black family. In the beginning, I told you that his mother or his wife was a Black woman. And in terms of being Black, and that the terminology during those times meant that there was no obvious mixture in the skin. So she must have been a dark woman, okay? And I can trace her heritage back to 1742 in this country. And I'm hit with the name Timothy Caesar, who was William Grimes's father-in-law. And by the way, Timothy Caesar was a Revolutionary War patriot. He served in Humphrey's all-Black militia. And I say that because I never learned in school that African Americans participated in the American Revolution. I never learned in school that African Americans participated in the Civil War even. And William Grimes had two sons to participate in the Civil War. So I'm all over the place with the story because there's so much to say about it and I have so little time. But I did want to make it known that Timothy Caesar, a Black man who was probably first generation African-American, served in the Revolutionary War. And he probably would be my link to Africa. And I hope to someday make that connection if I can.
Well, Regina, thank you so much for speaking today. I'm looking at the clock. It's almost 9 o'clock. I cannot believe how fast the time went this morning. So I think we'll have to, end things here, and we would love to have you come back with an update at some point.
I would love to.
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating. So thank you for joining us. Breakfast Clubbers, don't forget, next week we have New Kids on the Block. So we'll have the new kids out. And with that, I'll keep the room open for a few more minutes, but let's go ahead and end the recording now. And again, let's give a round of applause to Regina for such a great presentation.
Thank you, Regina.